Is it getting a little cold in here? Oh, I know why. It's because today we're going to be talking about the Cold War. So this period lasts from the end of World War II in 1945 to the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. But you can't really pinpoint a specific starting point like, oh, this is when the Cold War has begun, because there wasn't actually a declaration of war. The Cold War itself does not refer to an actual battle. It refers to an era in which there was a lot of political and ideological tension between the Soviet Union and the United States, who led Western Europe. Nonetheless, at the end of the war in 1945, you have the Yalta Conference, and this is where the initial foundations of disunity and hostility lie. The former allies in World War II are separated. You have the UK, US, and France on one side, and the Soviet Union by itself on the other side. And at this conference, Germany was separated into four divisions, the partition of Germany, and this allowed each of the former allies to effect transformations in their own zones, and this ultimately revealed the starkly different agenda the Soviet Union had in mind for not only Eastern Germany, but for the rest of the Eastern Bloc as well. And when I say the Eastern Bloc, I'm referring to the Soviet Union and its satellite states, which are the nations all under the communist Soviet sphere of influence. Not only within Eastern Germany, but throughout the whole Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union sought to gain control of the political life and slowly implement a Soviet-controlled communist regime. Thus marked the division between Western and Eastern Europe, the spread of US-led democracy versus the spread of Soviet-led communism. And this was not only an ideological difference, but it was a geopolitical difference as well, given Foreman Winston Churchill's legendary Iron Curtain speech, in which he cautioned of a potential future conflict with the USSR, and described the completely separate ideological agendas for post-war Europe as an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Now, the US wasn't going to just sit back and watch communism take over Europe, no. They adopted the policy of containment in 1947 and pledged to prevent the further spread of communism because they saw it as a threat to the democracy and American life. This containment policy influenced the creation of the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and the Marshall Plan, which was in effect from 1949 to 51. And both of these programs sought to prevent communism from spreading into economically devastated countries by providing large amounts of financial aid to those countries to rebuild their infrastructure and their economies. Now, this Marshall Plan actually was a huge success because as a result of the $13 billion financial aid package the US sent to war-torn Europe, Western and Central Europe actually recovered economically. This is often referred to as the economic miracle. Not only did Western Europeans recover economically, but they're able to unify politically through the formation of a little organization called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, founded in 1949. This was a collective security organization of all the democracies in Europe, including the US and Canada, that agreed to prevent Soviet expansion in Europe and to come to each other's defense if one of the nations was attacked. The USSR, they were feeling a little threatened here, so they formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955 in response to the NATO coalition. And the Warsaw Pact had the same goals, but it was just meant for the Eastern Bloc countries. So speaking of, back in the USSR, Stalin resumed his extremely oppressive rule. The 5-year plan was reinstituted to reconstruct the economy, and with this came the rebirth of forced labor camps. Everyone's lives were miserable, and everyone's lives were dedicated to the production of heavy industry, so consumer goods, leisure time, out the window. Despite the reinstitution of the 5-year plan, post-war economic recovery in Eastern Europe during Stalin's reign still moved at a slow pace. But after Stalin dies, Khrushchev comes to power, and he sought to de-Stalinize the Soviet Union. He felt that the bad condition of agriculture, the shortages of numbers of consumer goods, and the consequent lack of motivation in workers were all due to the crimes of Stalin. And as part of this movement, he introduced the Gosplan policy. This basically deviated all means of production away from solely heavy industry, and he began to emphasize consumer goods and agriculture as well. He introduced this plan not only to try and de-Stalinize, but also to prove that communism was just as viable and was superior to capitalism. And he even had so much faith in his system that he told the US and our allies, "We will bury you," meaning he would overpower them economically. The de-Stalinization movement actually resulted in communist reformers and the people wanting more liberty and national independence. However, as seen in the Hungarian uprising, such nationalist and democratic insurgencies were crushed by the Soviet military. Tension between the US and the USSR mounted significantly during Khrushchev's rule. He went from wanting peaceful coexistence with the West to wanting to bury them economically. So an example of an emerging tension between the US and the USSR is the successful mission of the Russian satellite, the Sputnik. This sparked the space race between the US and the USSR, because the US, they were terrified that they had fallen behind the USSR in space technology. But unfortunately, the tensions over spacecraft weren't the only cause for hostility. In 1959, the newly communist Cuba under Fidel Castro became an ally of the Soviet Union. And in response to the US placing missiles in Turkey, which was in range of Moscow, Khrushchev tried to place Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba to protect Cuba from a future US invasion, because, right, containment, the US doesn't want Cuba being communist. So thus began the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1962, the US demanded the Soviets remove the missiles from Cuba, and the tension grew so much that the US and the USSR were on the brink of nuclear war. But this is when the MAD doctrine, or mutually assured destruction, kicked in order to prevent an all-out nuclear warfare. Khrushchev eventually agreed to the removal of missiles from Cuba if the US removed their missiles from Turkey. But this crisis nonetheless marked a pinnacle in the Cold War, in which the temperature could have risen and things might have not been so cold anymore. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev was ousted from his leadership position because members of his party were dissatisfied with his decision-making and they thought he was becoming a little too soft, especially in the Cuban Missile Crisis when he eventually conceded to JFK. And after him came Leonid Brezhnev, who did the exact opposite of Khrushchev and actually began re-Stalinization. So in response to the weak play of power Khrushchev exhibited at the Cuban Missile Crisis, he pushed for a massive arms buildup. And because of this aggressive rebuilding of their own government, the US and the USSR relations actually seemed to be more peaceful in this period, even though that wasn't necessarily Brezhnev's intention. The communist reach of the USSR was threatened during Brezhnev's reign in Prague Spring and the invasion of Czechoslovakia. The new Czechoslovak Communist Party leader sought to bring in socialism with a human face, and he sought greater democracy and freedom of speech. But this vision was not realized because Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia and the Brezhnev Doctrine was issued, stating that the USSR and its allies had the right to intervene in any socialist country if Soviet communism was being threatened. So this was kind of like the Truman Doctrine, but trying to maintain communism instead of preventing it. When Gorbachev came to power in 1985, Cold War tensions began to reduce. Gorbachev was considerably younger than his predecessors, so he was more liberal than the traditional communist hardliners before him. He introduced the policies of perestroika. I'm pretty sure that's how you say it. I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone out there, but just remember, students, spelling and pronunciation doesn't count on the test. So anyways, he introduced the policy of perestroika, which aimed to boost the sluggish Soviet economy by infusing elements of capitalism and free market practices of the West. And he also introduced the policy of glasnost. Now don't get this confused with Glasplan, which is in Khrushchev's time. We're in Gorbachev's time. So he introduced the policy of glasnost, which sought to create more openness in Soviet society by introducing free speech and more political liberty. These policies in themselves demonstrate Gorbachev's willingness to reduce East-West tensions and just acknowledge that, hey, maybe straight-out traditional communism isn't what we need to become almighty again. So Gorbachev went on to encourage reform movements in Poland and Hungary and even repudiated the Brezhnev Doctrine by swearing to respect the political choices of people in Eastern Europe. And thanks to him, communist control of Europe ended. And whether he was aware of it or not, his policies of perestroika and glasnost, they shattered communism from the inside. They crushed communism internally. And then you have other external forces like revolutions and also the whole Allied cause trying to spread democracy. They're crushing communists from the outside, externally. The revolutions of 1989 in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Albania, and Czechoslovakia all succeeded in overthrowing oppressive communist rule. The Berlin Wall, a symbol of communist oppression, came down, and Germany was reunified. And with all of that, Gorbachev was like, okay, things are getting a little too out of hand, because he was losing communist control of territories left and right. So at the end of 1990, he appointed some more traditionalists and hardline communists to government positions to make the prospect of future reform less likely. But these very people, frustrated by Soviet loss of power from the revolutions of 1989, they tried to overthrow Gorbachev. And this coup actually failed, but because it failed, any hope of preserving communist control also failed, because those same people that staged the coup They're the hardline communists. So when they failed, communism fails, the Soviet Union dissolves by the end of 1991, and Boris Yeltsin became the president of a newly created Russian Federation. The Cold War has ended.